The brass doorbell at Pine Ridge Hardware chimed as two men stepped inside, their eyes scanning the store with predatory intent. What they saw was exactly what they expected. A quiet woman behind the counter, alone, counting the day's cash receipts. What they didn't see was the way her posture subtly shifted, how her hands moved with controlled precision, or the calculating assessment happening behind her calm brown eyes. In exactly 44 seconds, Vincent Kowalski and Danny Reeves would discover that some people are not what they appear to be, and that targeting the wrong person can turn a simple robbery into a lesson they'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Natalie Brennan had been invisible in Riverside Falls, Oregon, for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that she was counting. The small mountain town nestled between timber forests and the rushing Cascade River provided everything she needed: anonymity, quiet, and enough distance from her former life that she could almost forget who she used to be. Almost. Every morning at 7 sharp, she unlocked the heavy wooden door of Pine Ridge Hardware Store, a weathered building that had stood on Main Street since 1952. The previous owner, according to the carefully constructed story she'd built, was her Uncle Harold, a man who'd never existed but whose fictional life was documented in a forged paperwork to satisfy any casual investigation. The store specialized in practical necessities: screws, nails, paint, fishing tackle, and the kind of reliable tools that mountain folk depended on when the nearest Home Depot was a 3-hour drive through winding forest roads. Natalie understood tools. More importantly, she understood that most people saw exactly what they expected to see. When locals looked at her, they saw a 31-year-old woman with shoulder-length auburn hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing sensible jeans and flannel shirts that suggested someone comfortable with physical work, but nothing more threatening than operating a cash register. Her hands showed calluses that came from handling inventory and helping customers load lumber, not from the specialized training that had once made her one of the military's most effective operators. The transformation had been deliberate and complete. Gone were the close-cropped hair, the ramrod posture, and the hyper-awareness that marked career military personnel. In their place was Natalie Brennan, a woman who'd inherited a hardware store and chosen the quiet, mountain life over whatever existed in the world beyond Riverside Falls. She wore reading glasses she didn't need, spoke with a softer voice than came naturally, and had perfected the art of appearing helpless when customers needed heavy items moved or technical questions answered about power tools. Helen Varga, who owned Murphy's Tavern 3 doors down, had appointed herself Natalie's unofficial protector and source of local gossip. Helen was 62, built like a lumberjack, and possessed the kind of maternal instincts that extended to every person in town under 40. She stopped by the hardware store every morning at 8:15 with coffee and whatever news the mountain town's gossip network had generated overnight. "Tommy Chun's been asking about you again," Helen announced on this particular Tuesday morning, setting down 2 steaming cups from her tavern. "That boy's been smitten since you fixed his truck's radiator last month. Keeps finding excuses to need hardware supplies." Natalie accepted the coffee with a grateful smile, though her internal assessment noted that Tommy was 23, drove recklessly on mountain roads, and had the kind of loose tongue that made him unsuitable for anything beyond casual friendliness. "He's sweet, but I'm not looking for complications." "Honey, you're 31 and living alone above a hardware store. A little complication might do you good." Helen settled her considerable frame against the counter, preparing for one of her extended social sessions. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen in a place like this? It's not like we've got dangerous criminals lurking around every corner." The irony wasn't lost on Natalie. Riverside Falls, population 2,847, had one part-time sheriff who spent most of his time dealing with drunk fishermen and the occasional domestic dispute. The most serious crime in recent memory was when someone spray-painted inappropriate words on the side of the old lumber mill. Yet Natalie maintained security protocols that would have impressed federal agents, routines that kept her aware of every person who entered her store, every unusual vehicle that passed through town, and every change in the patterns that define small-town life. Her apartment above the store reflected the same careful balance between ordinary and prepared. The living room contained comfortable furniture, books about local history, and the kind of decorative touches that suggested a woman settling into a quiet life. What visitors couldn't see was the reinforced doorframe, the security cameras hidden in decorative elements, or the specially modified closet that contained items no hardware store manager should possess. Behind a false wall, in what appeared to be a storage closet, Natalie maintained equipment that represented years of careful acquisition and modification. Military-grade communication devices capable of reaching secure frequencies from anywhere in the continental United States. Night vision equipment optimized for mountain terrain. Weapons that were untraceable and maintained with the kind of precision that spoke to professional training. Medical supplies sufficient for treating serious trauma. Cash in multiple currencies. Documents establishing 3 different backup identities, each as carefully constructed as Natalie Brennan herself. She'd learned the hard way that disappearing required more than just walking away. It demanded creating a life so thoroughly ordinary that it became invisible, developing relationships shallow enough to maintain, but not deep enough to invite scrutiny, and building routines that provided cover while maintaining readiness for the moment when the past inevitably came calling. The routine worked because she made it work. Every Tuesday and Friday, she drove her practical Honda Civic to Cedar Valley Regional Airport, ostensibly to pick up specialty orders for the store. In reality, she maintained contact with a network of former military personnel who'd also chosen civilian life but understood that some skills never became obsolete. Every Sunday, she hiked the mountain trails that surrounded Riverside Falls, routes that appeared recreational but actually served as reconnaissance of potential escape routes and defensive positions. The trails also provided solitude for the kind of physical training that kept her skills sharp without attracting attention. In hidden clearings accessible only to serious hikers, she practiced movement techniques, weapons handling, and tactical scenarios adapted to the mountain environment. To anyone who might observe, she appeared to be a nature enthusiast maintaining basic fitness. The reality was significantly more complex. Detective Ray Castellanos had noticed her, but not in the way that should have concerned her. Ray was 45, recently divorced, and possessed the kind of professional loneliness that made him protective of the town's residents. He'd tried asking her out twice, both times accepting her polite refusals with the kind of grace that suggested he understood the value of patience. What he didn't understand was that Natalie's careful assessment of him included detailed knowledge of his service record, his financial situation, and his weekly routine. She liked Ray, which made him dangerous in ways he couldn't comprehend. Liking people led to caring about them, and caring about people created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who might eventually come looking for the woman who'd once been known by an entirely different name. The name that haunted her thoughts was Phantom, the callsign she'd earned during 6 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment's Alpha Company. Phantom had been everything Natalie Brennan was not: aggressive, decisive, comfortable with violence, and utterly committed to missions that officially never happened. Phantom had operated in countries that didn't appear on any deployment records, eliminated threats that were never acknowledged, and saved lives that remained classified. The transition from Phantom to Natalie had required killing parts of herself that she sometimes missed. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in hostile territory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now manifested as knowing the location of every customer in her store, the positions of potential weapons, and exit strategies for scenarios that would never occur in peaceful Riverside Falls. The tactical thinking that had made her invaluable to military operations now applied itself to managing inventory and calculating profit margins on fishing lures. Sometimes, usually late at night when the mountain wind rattled her windows, she wondered if she'd traded too much for safety. The woman she'd been would have found the current life suffocating, but the woman she'd become understood that survival sometimes required sacrificing the parts of yourself that made you feel most alive. The past had a way of making itself known in unexpected moments. A helicopter passing overhead could trigger sense memories of insertion flights. The sound of vehicles moving information down Main Street during the annual Independence Day parade created automatic assessments of tactical positioning. Most troubling were the dreams where she was Phantom again, operating with the kind of lethal efficiency that had once defined her existence. Those dreams usually ended the same way, with the memory of why she'd walked away from everything she'd been trained to do. The mission that had gone wrong not because of enemy action or equipment failure, but because of betrayal by someone she'd trusted completely. The realization that the people giving orders had priorities that didn't always align with protecting the soldiers carrying them out. The understanding that being invisible in a small mountain town was preferable to being a target in a larger world where loyalty was a commodity and promises were negotiable. Marcus Webb had been her closest friend in Alpha Company, the man she'd trusted with her life on more missions than she could count. When everything went wrong, when the extraction that should have saved her team instead left 3 good soldiers dead and classified equipment in enemy hands, Marcus had been the one person she'd believed would stand with her against the officers, demanding explanations for a failure that wasn't her fault. Instead, Marcus had provided testimony that painted her as a liability, someone whose judgment had been compromised and whose continued service posed risks to unit effectiveness. The betrayal had been surgical in its precision, destroying her military career while protecting his own advancement. The last she'd heard, Marcus had been promoted to captain and assigned to Pentagon intelligence, exactly the kind of career progression that rewarded political awareness over battlefield competence. Leaving the military had been necessary, but disappearing completely had been survival. The people who'd sacrificed her to protect themselves wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a potential witness to their failures. Natalie Brennan existed because Phantom needed to die, and dying required more than changing names and locations. It required becoming someone so different that even people who'd known her intimately would struggle to make the connection. The transformation had worked perfectly for 3 years. Until this Tuesday morning in October, when 2 men walked into Pine Ridge Hardware store with intent that had nothing to do with purchasing supplies and everything to do with easy money they assumed would come from robbing a defenseless woman. Vincent Kowalski was 34 years old, recently released from a 5-year stint at Snake River Correctional Institution, and convinced that small-town businesses were soft targets operated by people too naive to understand real danger. His partner, Danny Reeves, was younger and less experienced but shared Vincent's assessment that a woman alone in a hardware store represented an opportunity rather than a threat. They'd been watching the store for 3 days, noting the patterns of customer traffic, the absence of security cameras they could identify, and the fact that Natalie appeared to handle transactions in cash rather than relying entirely on credit cards. Their plan was simple: wait until the store was empty, display weapons, demand money, and disappear into the forest roads that would make pursuit difficult for local law enforcement. What they hadn't factored into their assessment was that Natalie had been watching them since their first reconnaissance pass. She'd noted their vehicle, a stolen pickup truck with plates that didn't match the registration. She'd observed their behavior patterns, the way they moved with the kind of false casualness that marked people conducting surveillance. She'd identified the bulges under their clothing that suggested concealed weapons and assessed their probable approach routes based on the store's layout. Most importantly, she'd recognized them as the kind of threat that required phantom skills rather than Natalie's compliance. The brass doorbell chimed at 10:43 a.m., exactly 17 minutes after the last legitimate customer had left with a bag of wood screws and advice about winterizing his cabin's plumbing. Vincent entered first, his eyes sweeping the store with practiced assessment while Danny followed, positioning himself near the door in a way that suggested they'd planned their approach. Natalie continued counting the morning's receipts, her posture relaxed and unthreatening while her peripheral vision tracked both men's movements. Vincent approached the counter with exaggerated casualness, his right hand resting near his waistband, where she'd already identified the outline of a handgun. "Morning, ma'am," Vincent said, his voice carrying the kind of false politeness that preceded demands. "Quiet morning, isn't it? Not many customers around." "Tuesdays are usually slow," Natalie replied, her tone matching his casual approach while her mind cataloged tactical options. The nearest potential weapon was a hammer display 18 inches to her left. The panic button connected to the sheriff's office was mounted under the counter, but pressing it would only alert authorities who were 15 minutes away at best. The men's positioning suggested they'd planned this carefully enough to control the immediate situation. Danny shifted near the door, his nervous energy suggesting he was the less experienced of the pair. His weapon appeared to be a knife rather than a gun, which meant the primary threat came from Vincent's handgun and the men's willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. "You know," Vincent continued, "this seems like the kind of place that does a lot of cash business. People around here probably don't trust banks much, prefer to pay for their supplies with real money." "Some do," Natalie agreed, recognizing the precursor to a robbery demand while calculating response options. The men had made their intentions clear without yet committing to explicit threats, which meant she still had seconds to choose between compliance and confrontation. Vincent's hand moved toward his weapon, the gesture deliberate and threatening. "Why don't you open that register and show us how much real money you've got back there?" The moment of decision arrived exactly as Natalie had anticipated. She could comply, hand over the modest amount of cash in the register, and hope the men would leave without escalating to violence. Or she could remember that Phantom had never accepted victimization as an acceptable outcome. Her choice would determine not just the next 44 seconds, but whether the carefully constructed life of Natalie Brennan could survive the resurrection of skills she'd tried so hard to bury. The decision crystallized in Natalie's mind with the cold clarity that had once made her invaluable in combat situations. Vincent's hand completed its movement toward his concealed weapon, confirming what she'd already assessed about their intentions. Danny stepped closer to the door, blocking the most obvious exit route while maintaining visual contact with his partner. They'd rehearsed this approach, probably used it successfully on other small businesses, where compliance came from fear rather than capability. What they encountered instead was 44 seconds of violence so precise and controlled that security footage would later be studied by law enforcement training academies as an example of how quickly situations could reverse when criminals chose the wrong target. Vincent's fingers had barely closed around his pistol grip when Natalie moved. Her left hand swept the cash register's drawer closed with enough force to slam it shut, while her right hand grabbed the claw hammer from the display rack in a motion that appeared almost casual. The movement was so fluid that Vincent's brain processed it as nervous compliance rather than tactical positioning, a fatal misreading that cost him any chance of controlling the encounter. "Smart choice, lady," Vincent said, his weapon now halfway clear of his waistband. "Just keep being cooperative and nobody gets hurt." Natalie's response was to drive the hammer's claw end into Vincent's right wrist with surgical precision, targeting the specific pressure point where radial nerve met bone. The impact produced an audible crack that suggested fractured bones, followed immediately by Vincent's agonized scream and the metallic clatter of his pistol hitting the floor. His hand opened involuntarily, fingers spasming as damaged nerves failed to maintain their grip on anything more substantial than air. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, transforming Vincent from predator to casualty before Danny fully comprehended what was happening. Training that had been dormant for 3 years surged back with muscle memory that made conscious thought unnecessary. Natalie's body moved with the kind of lethal efficiency that came from years of scenarios where hesitation meant death and overwhelming force was the only acceptable response to threat. Danny's knife appeared in his left hand as he lunged toward the counter, his face twisted with rage and confusion. His approach was aggressive but untrained, the kind of attack that relied on intimidation rather than technique. Against an ordinary store clerk, it might have been effective. Against someone who'd survived close-quarters combat in environments where mistakes were measured in body counts, it was suicide. Natalie pivoted on her left foot, using Danny's momentum against him as she grabbed his knife hand with both of hers. The technique was textbook disarmament, practiced thousands of times until it became as automatic as breathing. She twisted his wrist inward while pulling his arm across her body, applying leverage that forced him to either drop the weapon or accept the dislocated shoulder. Danny chose to fight the hold, which proved to be another tactical error. Natalie used his resistance to drive her knee into his solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. The impact expelled all the air from his lungs in a whistling gasp, followed immediately by the knife clattering to the floor as his body prioritized breathing over weapon retention. Vincent was attempting to retrieve his pistol with his undamaged left hand, his movements clumsy and desperate. Blood streamed from his shattered wrist, but adrenaline and desperation were driving him to continue the fight despite obvious injuries. Natalie assessed his position and threat level in the fraction of a second it took to release Danny's now limp form. Her response was to close the distance between herself and Vincent in 2 quick steps, arriving just as his fingers touched the pistol's grip. The heel of her right boot connected with his reaching hand, pinning it against the floor while simultaneously crushing the small bones that controlled finger movement. Vincent's second scream was higher pitched than the first, carrying notes of shock and disbelief that suggested he was beginning to understand how completely the situation had reversed. Danny was struggling to breathe, his diaphragm paralyzed by the precise kidney punch that had ended his participation in the robbery. Natalie kicked his knife across the store's floor, sending it skittering under a display of paint cans where it would remain out of reach even if he recovered enough to continue fighting. His face was turning an alarming shade of purple as his respiratory system slowly remembered how to function. Vincent lay on his back, both hands now damaged beyond use, staring up at a woman who appeared completely calm despite having just dismantled 2 armed men in under a minute. Blood pooled beneath his wrists, and shock was beginning to set in as his nervous system processed trauma that his mind couldn't quite accept. The predatory confidence that had carried him into the store was gone, replaced by the kind of terror that came from realizing you'd made a mistake that might prove fatal. "You have exactly 30 seconds to tell me who sent you," Natalie said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that suggested cooperation was strongly recommended. She stood between both men and their weapons, her posture relaxed but ready to respond to any continued resistance. "Nobody sent us," Vincent gasped, cradling his mangled right hand against his chest. "We just thought we needed money. Jesus, lady, what are you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. What was she? Natalie Brennan, small-town hardware store manager who helped customers find the right screws for their home projects? Or Phantom, the operator who'd eliminated targets in environments where failure meant death for entire teams. The line between those identities had blurred the moment Vincent reached for his weapon. Danny managed to draw a shuddering breath, his respiratory system finally overriding the trauma that had paralyzed his diaphragm. His eyes darted between Natalie and the door, calculating whether escape was possible. The calculation was complicated by the fact that his legs didn't seem to be responding to conscious commands, and the woman standing over him looked perfectly capable of preventing any attempt at flight. "Local police will be here in approximately 12 minutes, Natalie continued, her internal chronometer automatically tracking the response time based on distance from the sheriff's office. "Emergency medical services will arrive 3 minutes. After that, whether you require their services for traumatic injuries or simple restraint depends entirely on your cooperation." Vincent's face had gone pale as blood loss and shock began affecting his cognitive function. "We're not working for anybody. We heard this place kept cash on hand, thought it would be easy money. We didn't know you were some kind of martial arts expert or whatever." The assessment was close enough to satisfy Natalie that their robbery attempt was opportunistic rather than targeted. Random criminals looking for easy money were infinitely preferable to professional operators sent by people who might have connected Natalie Brennan to her previous identity. Still, the encounter had exposed capabilities that couldn't be easily explained away. She moved to the store's front window, checking sightlines while maintaining visual contact with both men. The street remained empty except for Helen's pickup truck parked outside Murphy's Tavern, where the lunch crowd was probably discussing weather patterns and fishing conditions. Normal small-town rhythms that would be disrupted when law enforcement arrived to investigate whatever story she chose to tell about the morning's events. The official narrative would require careful construction. 2 armed men had attempted to rob her store. She'd defended herself using whatever weapons were available, specifically a hammer from her own inventory. The injuries sustained by the perpetrators were the result of their own aggressive actions and poor tactical decisions. Self-defense was justifiable, especially when faced with weapons and explicit threats. What couldn't be explained was the precision with which she'd disabled both men, the tactical awareness that had allowed her to anticipate their movements, or the calm control she'd maintained throughout an encounter that should have left an ordinary civilian traumatized. Those details would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer, especially if Detective Castellanos decided to investigate beyond the surface facts. Danny had recovered enough motor function to sit up against the wall, though his breathing remained labored and his face showed the kind of confusion that came from having your assumptions about reality violently adjusted. "You broke us both. In like 10 seconds, he wheezed. "Nobody fights like that. What kind of store manager knows how to do that stuff?" "The kind who grew up with 4 older brothers and learned to take care of herself," Natalie replied, providing a cover story that would sound plausible to anyone not familiar with military close-quarters combat techniques. Violence isn't complicated when you're not afraid of getting hurt. Vincent was beginning to show signs of serious blood loss, his skin growing clammy and his responses becoming sluggish. The injury to his right wrist had damaged major blood vessels along with bone and nerve tissue. Without medical attention, he could progress from shock to unconsciousness, which would create complications for the story she needed law enforcement to accept. She moved to the store's first aid station, retrieving supplies that would stabilize his condition without eliminating evidence of what had happened. Military medic training surfaced automatically as she assessed wound severity and began pressure bandaging that would control bleeding while preserving the injury patterns that supported self-defense claims. "Hold still," she instructed Vincent, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she wrapped his damaged wrist. "You're losing blood faster than you can afford. This will slow it down until paramedics arrive." Vincent stared at her with growing comprehension that whatever he'd thought he understood about the situation was incomplete. "You know medical stuff too. What the hell kind of store manager are you?" "The kind who took first aid classes because I work alone in a business that involves power tools and sharp objects," Natalie replied, continuing her bandaging while monitoring his vital signs. Basic trauma care is just practical preparation. The explanation was reasonable enough to satisfy casual investigation, but she could see doubt beginning to form in Vincent's eyes. Pain and shock might have affected his cognitive function, but they hadn't eliminated his ability to recognize that her responses went far beyond normal civilian capabilities. Danny was watching her movements with similar suspicion, his expression suggesting he was beginning to question their initial assessment of her as an easy target. Both men had encountered violence before, probably as perpetrators rather than victims. They understood the difference between lucky self-defense and trained combat response. What they'd experienced fell clearly into the latter category, which meant their eventual testimony could include details that would draw unwanted attention to her background. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that someone had heard the commotion and called law enforcement. Probably Helen, whose protective instincts would have been triggered by sounds of conflict from the hardware store. The arrival of official responders would mark the beginning of a process that could either reinforce Natalie Brennan's civilian identity or expose inconsistencies that led to deeper investigation. Detective Castellanos would be among the responding officers, which created both opportunities and risks. His personal interest in her might make him more inclined to accept her version of events without excessive scrutiny. Alternatively, his law enforcement training might cause him to notice details that suggested her capabilities exceeded those of an ordinary citizen defending her business. The key would be presenting a narrative that satisfied official requirements, while redirecting attention toward the criminal's actions rather than her response. Victims were rarely subjected to intensive investigation, especially when the evidence clearly supported justifiable self-defense. The challenge would be maintaining that victim status despite having neutralized two armed attackers with efficiency that bordered on professional. Vincent's condition was stabilizing as the pressure bandages controlled blood loss, though his color remained poor and his responses indicated ongoing shock. Danny had recovered most of his motor function, but seemed reluctant to attempt any movement. That might be interpreted as aggressive. Both men appeared to understand that their situation had deteriorated far beyond their original expectations. The sirens were getting closer, probably less than 2 minutes away based on acoustic analysis of their approach route. Natalie used the remaining time to arrange physical evidence in ways that would support her intended narrative. The hammer she'd used as a weapon was placed near the cash register, positioned to suggest she'd grabbed it desperately during the encounter rather than wielding it with tactical precision. Vincent's pistol remained on the floor where it had fallen, its location consistent with her claim that she'd defended herself before he could complete his draw. Danny's knife had skidded under the paint display, its position suggesting it had been dropped during the struggle rather than systematically disarmed through military techniques. The overall scene portrayed chaos and desperation rather than controlled violence, exactly the impression needed to support self-defense claims. Most importantly, she adjusted her own appearance to match the narrative. A small cut on her left hand, created by deliberately scraping her knuckles against the cash register's edge, provided evidence that she'd been injured during the encounter. Her flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder, damage that suggested she'd fought desperately rather than dominated the situation from the beginning. Her hair was disheveled, and she made sure her breathing appeared elevated in ways consistent with fear and adrenaline rather than tactical exertion. The police cruiser pulled up outside just as she finished her preparations, its red and blue lights casting dramatic shadows through the store's windows. Detective Castellanos emerged from the passenger seat while a uniformed deputy took position near the entrance, their approach suggesting they were responding to a possible hostage situation rather than a completed crime. Ray's eyes swept the store's interior, taking in the two injured men on the floor, and Natalie standing behind the counter with blood on her hands and obvious signs of physical conflict. His expression showed relief that she appeared unharmed. followed immediately by professional assessment of the scene and its implications. "Natalie, are you okay?" He called through the door, his weapon drawn but not aimed at any specific target. "Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," she replied, her voice carrying just the right note of shaken composure. "They tried to rob the store. I fought back. They're both injured and need paramedics." Ray approached cautiously, his training evident in the way he maintained visual contact with both suspects while positioning himself to provide cover for his partner. The deputy moved to secure the weapons that lay scattered across the floor, following standard protocols for crime scene preservation. "Can you tell me what happened?" Ray asked, holstering his weapon as he assessed the scene's safety. His eyes took in the evidence of violence, the positioning of weapons, and Natalie's condition with the kind of professional thoroughness that could either validate or complicate her story. "They came in around 10:40, Natalie began, providing details with the kind of precision that suggested good memory rather than rehearsed testimony. "The older one approached the counter and demanded I open the register. When I hesitated, he started drawing a gun. I grabbed the hammer and hit his hand before he could point it at me. The younger one came at me with a knife, so I fought him off too." The timeline was accurate, the sequence of events matched the physical evidence, and her emotional state appeared consistent with civilian trauma response. Ray nodded as he recorded her statement, his expression suggesting he found the narrative believable despite the extent of injuries sustained by both attackers. Vincent attempted to speak, his voice weak but audible. "She's not telling you everything. Nobody fights like that. She knew exactly what she was doing." Ray glanced at Vincent with the kind of skeptical expression reserved for criminals attempting to blame their victims. "You're saying she planned to get robbed? That she somehow orchestrated this whole situation?" "I'm saying she's not what she appears to be," Vincent insisted, though his words were becoming slurred as shock affected his cognitive function. "Normal people don't move like that. She's had training, serious training." Danny nodded weakly in agreement. "She disabled us both in seconds. Professional stuff, not lucky self-defense." Ray studied Natalie's face, looking for signs that the accusations contained elements of truth. What he saw was a woman who appeared shaken by violence, relieved to be safe, and slightly confused by her attacker's claims about her fighting ability. "I have 4 older brothers," she said, repeating the cover story she'd used earlier. "They made sure I could take care of myself. When someone threatens you with weapons, you do whatever it takes to survive." The explanation satisfied Ray's immediate questions, though she could see him filing away details for later consideration. His professional experience included enough domestic violence cases to recognize the difference between systematic training and desperate self-defense. But his personal interest in her created motivation to accept the version of events that cast her as victim rather than potential threat. Emergency medical technicians arrived as Ray was completing his preliminary investigation. Their equipment and expertise focused on stabilizing Vincent's condition and assessing Danny's injuries. The medical response provided additional validation for Natalie's narrative, since the extent of trauma was consistent with defensive actions rather than systematic assault. Vincent was loaded onto a stretcher with his wrists properly immobilized and 4 fluids addressing blood loss and shock. His condition had improved enough to allow transport, though he continued making statements about Natalie's fighting ability that the paramedics dismissed as trauma-induced confusion. Danny was able to walk to the ambulance under his own power, though he required assistance due to lingering effects from the solar plexus strike. "We'll need you to come to the station for a complete statement," Ray told her as the ambulances departed with their patients. "Nothing formal, just getting everything documented properly. You should probably have that cut on your hand looked at too." Natalie nodded agreement while internally calculating the risks associated with deeper official investigation. A detailed statement would require maintaining consistency with her initial account while providing enough additional information to satisfy investigative requirements. The medical attention would create documentation of her minor injury, supporting the claim that she'd been harmed during the encounter. Most critically, she needed to ensure that any follow-up investigation focused on Vincent and Danny's criminal activities rather than her response to their attack. Criminal histories, possible connections to other robberies, and background checks that might reveal whether their targeting of her store was random or deliberate. The store would need to remain closed for the rest of the day while crime scene. Technicians processed evidence and documented the encounter. Insurance claims would require detailed reports about property damage and business interruption. The bureaucratic aftermath of violence often proved more complicated than the violence itself, especially when maintaining false identities depended on avoiding intensive official scrutiny. As Ray prepared to escort her to the police station, Natalie took one final look around Pine Ridge Hardware Store. The familiar space where she'd spent 3 years building a quiet life now contained bloodstains and evidence markers that suggested tranquility was more fragile than she'd allowed herself to believe. The carefully constructed world of Natalie Brennan had survived its first serious test, but the encounter had revealed vulnerabilities in her cover identity that might prove problematic if the wrong people started asking the right questions. Vincent and Danny's insistence that she possessed professional fighting skills could attract attention from law enforcement, agencies with more sophisticated investigative capabilities than Riverside Falls' small police department. For now, she remained the victim of a failed robbery, a small-town business owner who defended herself with courage and good fortune. Whether that narrative would survive more detailed scrutiny remained to be seen, but she'd bought time to assess threats and adjust her security posture accordingly. The transformation from Phantom to Natalie Brennan had required 3 years of careful construction. Maintaining that identity might prove even more challenging than creating it, especially now that her capabilities had been demonstrated in ways that couldn't be completely hidden or explained away. As she walked toward Ray's police cruiser, Natalie wondered if the 44 seconds of violence in her store had marked the beginning of the end for her carefully constructed civilian life. Some secrets were too dangerous to expose, and some skills were too distinctive to disguise indefinitely. The real test would come when Vincent and Danny were interviewed by investigators who understood the difference between lucky self-defense and systematic military training. Their testimony could either reinforce her victim status or raise questions that led to background checks sophisticated enough to uncover inconsistencies in her documented history. For 3 years, she'd been invisible in Riverside Falls. Now she was the center of a criminal investigation that could either validate her civilian identity or destroy it completely. The next few days would determine whether Natalie Brennan could continue to exist, or whether the woman known as Phantom would be forced to disappear once again. The Riverside Falls Police Department occupied a converted fire station that had been built in 1963, when the town's population was half its current size, and the most serious crimes involved drunk loggers settling disputes with their fists. Detective Ray Castellanos led Natalie through the modest lobby past walls decorated with community service awards and photographs of long-retired officers, their faces reflecting simpler times when law enforcement meant knowing everyone's name, and their family history going back 3 generations. The interview room was cramped but comfortable, furnished with mismatched chairs and a scarred wooden table that had probably witnessed thousands of statements about domestic disputes, petty theft, and the occasional drug offense. A single overhead fluorescent light cast harsh shadows that made everyone look guilty of something, though Ray immediately adjusted the blinds to soften the atmosphere. His consideration for her comfort suggested this was more consultation than interrogation, at least for now. "Can I get you coffee or water?" Ray asked, settling into the chair across from her while producing a digital recorder and yellow legal pad. "I know this morning was traumatic. Take all the time you need." Natalie accepted coffee, using the brief delay to study the rooms. Layout and security features. No two-way mirror, which meant any observation would come through the single door or hidden recording equipment. The digital recorder was standard police issue, probably backed up by video cameras mounted in corners. She could identify through peripheral vision. Nothing suggested enhanced surveillance, but small-town police departments sometimes received federal assistance for cases that attracted outside attention. Before we start, Ray continued, I want you to know that everything indicates clear self-defense. You were protecting yourself and your property from armed criminals. Nobody's questioning your right to do that. The reassurance was genuine, but Natalie recognized the technique. Establish rapport and comfort before moving to questions that might reveal inconsistencies or details that complicated simple narratives. Ray was better at his job than his casual demeanor suggested, which meant she needed to maintain consistent character portrayal throughout whatever questioning followed. I keep replaying it in my mind, she said, allowing slight tremor into her voice while maintaining eye contact that suggested honesty under stress. Everything happened so fast, I'm not even sure I remember all the details correctly. Ray activated the recorder and began with standard procedural questions: her full name, address, length of residence in Riverside Falls, and relationship to the business she'd been defending. The routine information provided baseline for detecting any deception that might emerge during more substantive questioning. Tell me about your family background, Ray continued. You mentioned 4 older brothers who taught you self-defense. The cover story she'd referenced earlier required expansion into believable detail without creating elements that could be fact-checked. We grew up in Montana, near Billings. My father worked construction. My mother was a nurse. The boys were typical brothers, always roughhousing and including me, whether I wanted to participate or not. By the time I was 12, I could hold my own in most situations. The fictional family history had been carefully constructed years ago, based on real people whose records could support casual investigation, while providing reasonable explanation for her physical capabilities. Montana's rural culture emphasized self-reliance and practical skills that included personal protection, making her story plausible to anyone familiar with that environment. What brought you to Riverside Falls? Ray asked. It's pretty isolated. For someone used to city life. I inherited the hardware store from my Uncle Harold, Natalie replied, sticking to established background. After he died, I had the choice of selling it or moving here to run it myself. The quiet life appealed to me after some personal problems in Montana. The reference to personal problems provided explanation for her desire to remain private without specifying details that could be investigated. Most people understood the need to escape difficult situations, and Ray's expression suggested he accepted the explanation without requiring elaboration. Walk me through this morning's events, Ray said, shifting to the specific incident. Start from when you opened the store and tell me everything you remember, even details that might seem unimportant. Natalie provided a chronological account. That matched her earlier statement while adding enough additional detail to demonstrate good recall under stress. The timing of customers, her routine activities, and her observations about the 2 men's suspicious behavior all supported the narrative of random, criminal targeting rather than planned surveillance. When Vincent approached the counter, did he say anything specific about why he chose your store? Ray asked. Anything that suggested he might have been watching you or planning this for a while. The question was more sophisticated than it appeared, designed to uncover whether the robbery attempt had been random or targeted. Targeted crimes often indicated broader criminal conspiracies that required federal investigation, while random robberies remained local jurisdiction matters. He mentioned that small-town businesses keep more cash on hand, Natalie replied. Nothing that suggested specific knowledge about my operations or finances. It seemed like they assumed I was an easy target because I work alone. Ray made notes. While maintaining the kind of neutral expression that suggested he was recording information rather than evaluating its credibility. His technique was professional enough to avoid telegraphing whether he found her account convincing or problematic. "Describe the moment when Vincent reached for his weapon," Ray continued. "What exactly did you see, and how did you respond?" This question required careful handling, since her response time and tactical precision were the elements most likely to raise suspicions about her background. The key was emphasizing fear and desperation rather than training and control. "I saw his hand moving towards something under his shirt," Natalie said, adding appropriate hesitation to suggest she was reliving traumatic memories. "I knew he was going for a gun, and I panicked. The hammer was right there on the display rack, so I grabbed it and swung as hard as I could. I wasn't thinking about technique or strategy, just survival." The description portrayed instinctive, rather than calculated action, which aligned with civilian self-defense patterns. Her emphasis on panic and desperation provided emotional context that could explain the effectiveness of her response without requiring professional training. "The injury to Vincent's wrist was quite severe," Ray noted. "Emergency room doctors said it would require surgery to repair nerve and bone damage. That's unusual for a single strike from a hammer." Natalie felt the first flicker of genuine concern about the direction of questioning. Medical evidence provided objective assessment of force and precision that couldn't be dismissed as witness confusion or criminal exaggeration. Ray's observation suggested he'd been thinking about the incident beyond simple procedural documentation. "I hit him as hard as I could," she replied, maintaining direct eye contact while allowing defensive tension into her posture. "When someone's threatening you with a gun, you don't hold back. I was fighting for my life." Ray nodded acknowledgement while continuing to take notes. "What about Danny?" "He was carrying a knife, but according to the medical report, his injuries were consistent with specific pressure point strikes rather than random defensive actions." The questioning was becoming more pointed, focusing on technical aspects of the encounter that revealed her combat knowledge. Ray's law enforcement experience included enough exposure to military veterans that he could probably recognize systematic training when he encountered it. "I don't know anything about pressure points," Natalie said, introducing slight frustration into her voice. "I need him in the stomach as hard as I could, just like my brothers taught me. If that hit some kind of nerve or something, it was luck, not skill." The explanation was plausible enough to satisfy casual investigation, but she could see Ray processing details that didn't quite align with typical civilian self-defense encounters. His next questions would determine whether his suspicions rose to the level of formal inquiry or remained manageable professional curiosity. Before Ray could continue, his radio crackled with urgent communication from the dispatcher. "Detective Castellanos, we have federal agents requesting immediate consultation regarding the hardware store incident. They're en route to your location." The announcement hit Natalie like a physical blow, though she maintained outward composure while her mind raced through implications. Federal involvement suggested that Vincent and Danny's criminal histories included elements that triggered interagency cooperation, or that some aspect of the morning's events had raised flags in databases monitored by agencies with broader investigative mandates. Ray's expression showed surprise that mirrored her own carefully controlled reaction. "Federal agents? What's their interest in a simple robbery case?" "Unknown at this time," the dispatcher replied. "2 agents from Portland Field Office, ETA, approximately 30 minutes. Ray deactivated his radio and studied Natalie's face with increased attention. "Did you recognize either of the men who tried to rob you? Any chance this wasn't as random as it appeared?" "I'd never seen them before today," Natalie replied truthfully, though her mind was calculating whether Vincent or Danny might have criminal connections that could lead to deeper investigation of everyone involved in the incident. "Is federal involvement normal for robbery cases?" "Not usually," Ray admitted, "unless the perpetrators are wanted for crimes across state lines, or there's some connection to ongoing federal investigations. The possibilities were troubling, but manageable if federal interest focused on the criminals rather than their victim. Vincent and Danny's backgrounds might include interstate criminal activity that warranted FBI attention, while her role remained peripheral as the person they'd chosen to victimize. The challenge would be maintaining victim status if federal agents proved more skilled at recognizing military training than small-town detectives. Should I be worried? Natalie asked, projecting appropriate civilian concern about unexpected federal attention. I just defended myself against 2 criminals. I didn't do anything wrong. Ray's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine protective instinct. You have nothing to worry about. You're the victim here, and everything supports that. But federal agents sometimes ask different questions than local police, approach things from angles we might not consider. The warning was well-intentioned but confirmed her assessment that federal involvement could expose inconsistencies in her background that local investigation might overlook. FBI agents routinely dealt with cases involving organized crime, terrorism, and other threats that required sophisticated deception detection capabilities. 20 minutes later, Special Agents Lisa Moreau and David Chun arrived at the police station with the kind of professional bearing that suggested federal law enforcement experience. Moreau was approximately 40, with short blonde hair and the kind of controlled intensity that marked career investigators. Chun appeared younger, but carried himself with similar authority, his movements suggesting comfort with potentially dangerous situations. Detective Castellanos? Moreau approached with credentials already displayed. I'm Special Agent Moreau. This is Agent Chun. We need to discuss the incident at Pine Ridge Hardware Store. Ray studied their identification with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of proper federal procedure. What's FBI interest in a local robbery case? Vincent Kowalski and Danny Reeves are persons of interest in several ongoing investigations, Sheen explained. Interstate transportation of stolen goods, weapons trafficking, possible connections to organized crime. Their arrest here creates opportunities for cooperation that could benefit multiple cases. The explanation was reasonable and focused. Attention on the criminals rather than their victim, which should have relieved Natalie's concerns. Instead, she felt growing unease about the level of scrutiny that federal investigation might bring to everyone connected with the incident. Ms. Brennan, Moreau said, turning her attention toward Natalie with the kind of professional assessment that suggested trained observation skills. We understand you successfully defended yourself against 2 armed criminals. That was impressive work. The compliment carried undertones that suggested Moreau had reviewed preliminary reports and found elements worth additional examination. Federal agents didn't typically express admiration for civilian self-defense unless specific aspects of the incident raised their professional interest. I was lucky, Natalie replied, maintaining the modest tone that characterized her cover persona. They underestimated what someone will do when they're fighting for their life. Chun consulted a tablet containing what appeared to be detailed case files. According to medical reports, both attackers sustained injuries requiring specialized trauma care. Vincent Kowalski has multiple fractures to his right wrist, with nerve damage that may result in permanent disability. Danny Reeves suffered what doctors describe as precisely targeted strikes to specific anatomical vulnerabilities. The clinical description made her defensive actions sound more professional than she'd intended, emphasizing the technical precision that could indicate systematic training. Federal agents routinely encountered military veterans whose civilian lives masked combat backgrounds, making them more likely to recognize telltale signs. I don't understand the medical terminology, Natalie said, projecting appropriate confusion. About technical details. I hit them wherever I could reach, trying to stop them from hurting me. Moreau exchanged glances with Chun in a way that suggested they were communicating through shared professional experience. Their body language indicated they'd observed something worth noting, though they hadn't yet decided whether additional investigation was warranted. "We'd like to review the crime scene," Moreau continued. "Sometimes federal perspective reveals details that might not be apparent to local investigation." Ray nodded cooperation while maintaining territorial awareness about his jurisdiction. "The scene's been processed and documented. We can provide access, but I'd appreciate being included in any additional evidence collection." The federal agents agreed to collaborative investigation while making it clear that their priorities might differ from local law enforcement concerns. Their interest in Vincent and Danny's criminal histories provided cover for examining all aspects of the incident, including details about Natalie's response that could reveal more than she'd intended. "Ms. Brennan," Chun said, "we may need additional statements from you as our investigation develops. Are you planning to remain in Riverside Falls for the immediate future?" The question was routine but carried implications that suggested ongoing federal interest in her cooperation. Extended investigation could require maintaining consistent character portrayal over weeks or months, increasing the likelihood that inconsistencies might emerge. "This is my home," Natalie replied. "My business is here, my life is here. I'm not planning to go anywhere." Moreau smiled with what might have been approval or professional assessment. "Good. Cooperative witnesses make our job much easier, and you've already demonstrated remarkable composure under pressure." After the federal agents departed to examine the crime scene, Ray resumed his interview with questions that seemed less significant than they had before federal involvement transformed a local incident into something requiring interagency cooperation. "Is there anything else about this morning that we haven't discussed?" Ray asked. "Any detail, no matter how small, that might help us understand what happened." Natalie provided additional information about her observations of Vincent and Danny's behavior before the robbery attempt, details that reinforced the narrative of random criminal targeting while avoiding elements that might suggest she'd been conducting counter-surveillance. The interview concluded with standard procedural requirements: contact information verification, instructions about potential court testimony, and reminders about available victim services. Ray's manner remained supportive and protective, suggesting that her civilian cover story had survived local law enforcement scrutiny. However, federal investigation would bring significantly more sophisticated analytical capabilities to bear on every aspect of the incident. FBI background checks could reveal inconsistencies in her documented history that local investigation might overlook. Database searches could connect Natalie Brennan to classified military records if someone knew where to look and had appropriate clearance levels. Most concerning was the possibility that federal agents might recognize her combat techniques from their own experience with military veterans or specialized training programs. Agent Moreau's comment about remarkable composure suggested she'd already noted elements that warranted additional attention. As Natalie prepared to return to her store, she calculated risks and response options with the kind of tactical thinking that belonged to Phantom rather than a civilian hardware store manager. Federal investigation created exposure opportunities that could compromise her carefully constructed identity, requiring immediate assessment of security vulnerabilities and potential countermeasures. The transformation from victim to person of interest could happen with bureaucratic efficiency that left little time for defensive adjustments. If federal agents decided that Natalie Brennan's background required deeper investigation, she might need to choose between maintaining her civilian identity and preserving her freedom. 3 years of quiet life in Riverside Falls hung in the balance, threatened by 44 seconds of violence that had revealed capability she'd tried so hard to conceal. The path she'd tried to escape was reaching toward her through federal databases and investigative protocols that could connect dots she'd thought were safely buried. Walking back toward Pine Ridge Hardware Store, Natalie wondered if the morning's robbery attempt had been the beginning of exposure rather than a successful test of her cover identity. Some secrets were too dangerous to survive intensive scrutiny, and some skills were too distinctive to explain as civilian self-defense. Federal agents were trained to recognize deception and inconsistency in ways that local law enforcement might miss. Their investigation could either validate her victim's status or reveal the professional soldier hiding behind the mask of small-town anonymity. For the first time since arriving in Riverside Falls, Natalie Brennan began planning for the possibility that her carefully constructed civilian life might need to end as suddenly as it had begun. The encrypted satellite phone buzzed once at 3:17 in the morning, its vibration cutting through the mountain silence like a blade through flesh. Natalie came instantly awake with the kind of total alertness that marked veterans who'd learned that survival often depended on the speed of transition from sleep to combat readiness. The phone's location in her hidden equipment cache meant someone with knowledge of her most classified contact protocols was attempting communication that couldn't wait for conventional business hours. She moved through her apartment with practiced silence, avoiding floorboards that creaked and maintaining visual discipline that kept her silhouette away from windows. 3 years of civilian life hadn't dulled the tactical awareness that made her catalog potential threats, escape routes, and weapon positions even during routine midnight movements. The phone continued its insistent buzzing from behind the false wall where it waited, alongside equipment that officially didn't exist. The caller identification showed only alphanumeric codes that referenced military communication networks she'd thought were permanently severed. Someone with access to classified frequency assignments and encryption protocols had decided that Natalie Brennan needed to hear information that couldn't be transmitted through normal channels. The implications were troubling enough to make her hesitate before accepting the connection. Phantom. The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, her former teammate whose betrayal had destroyed her military career and forced her disappearance into civilian anonymity. His use of her operational call sign suggested this communication related to classified matters rather than personal reconciliation, though the distinction might prove meaningless if he'd tracked her location. "Wrong number," Natalie replied, though her hand automatically moved toward the concealed weapons that represented her final line of defense against threats she'd hoped never to face again. Marcus's laugh carried the kind of dark humor that had once characterized their friendship during missions where death was a routine occupational hazard. "Still maintaining cover, I see. Very professional, though it's 3 years too late for operational security." The admission that he'd known her location for extended periods meant that federal investigation of the morning's robbery was no coincidence. Marcus had either been monitoring her activities through official channels or using his Pentagon intelligence position to track former Ghost Squadron personnel for reasons that probably involved eliminating potential witnesses to classified operations. "What do you want?" Natalie asked, abandoning pretense while maintaining emotional distance that suggested business rather than personal communication. "I want to offer you a job," Marcus replied. "Something that utilizes your particular skills and provides better compensation than selling screws and fishing tackle to mountain hermits." The offer was unexpected, but not surprising given federal attention that had followed the morning's incident. Marcus had probably been tracking her location for months or years, waiting for circumstances that would provide leverage for recruitment or elimination. Her public exposure during the robbery investigation created opportunities for both approaches. "I have a job," Natalie said. "It doesn't involve shooting people or lying to congressional oversight committees." Marcus's tone shifted toward the kind of professional seriousness that had once preceded mission briefings in classified facilities. "The private security industry has evolved considerably since you've been playing civilian. Government contracts that provide military-level compensation without the bureaucratic constraints that limited our effectiveness in uniform." The recruitment pitch was sophisticated enough to suggest that Marcus had prepared for this conversation, with detailed knowledge of her financial situation and personal motivations. Private military contractors routinely offered former special operations personnel compensation packages that exceeded government pay scales while providing operational flexibility that military service couldn't match. "Not interested," Natalie replied, though she recognized the technique being employed. Marcus was establishing rapport and common ground before presenting information that would make his offer seem necessary rather than optional. "Vincent Kowalski wasn't a random criminal," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested access to classified intelligence. "He's been working for organizations that have specific interest in former Ghost Squadron personnel. Your little hardware store encounter was a recruitment test, not a robbery attempt." The revelation hit like cold water, reframing the morning's events in ways that transformed her from victim to target. If Vincent and Danny had been conducting assessment rather than attempting robbery, their failure might have consequences beyond criminal prosecution. Organizations that tested former military personnel usually had specific operational requirements that didn't allow for refusal. "Explain," Natalie said, her tactical mind automatically shifting into threat assessment mode, while maintaining verbal neutrality that avoided confirming Marcus's accusations about her background. "Kowalski's been recruiting freelance operators for a private military company called Meridian Solutions," Marcus explained. "They specialize in operations that require deniable assets with specific skill sets. Former special operations personnel who've disappeared from official records are particularly valuable because they can't be traced back to government agencies." The business model was familiar from industry publications that circulated among military veterans seeking civilian careers. Private military companies offered lucrative contracts for individuals willing to operate in environments where government forces couldn't be officially deployed. Former Ghost Squadron personnel would be especially attractive because they're classified. Backgrounds provided capabilities without official accountability. "Why would they test me instead of making a direct offer?" Natalie asked, recognizing that her question implicitly acknowledged the accuracy of Marcus's assessment while seeking tactical information that could inform her response options. "Because they needed to verify that your skills remained current." "After 3 years of civilian life," Marcus replied. "Combat capabilities deteriorate without regular practice, and they couldn't afford to hire someone whose training had become obsolete." The explanation was professionally sound but raised additional questions about how Meridian Solutions had acquired information on her location and background. Organizations that recruited former military personnel usually worked through networks of veterans who maintained contact with their former colleagues. Marcus's knowledge of the situation suggested he was either working with Meridian Solutions or monitoring their activities through his intelligence position. "Your performance this morning convinced them that you're worth pursuing," Marcus continued. "Which means they'll be making more direct contact soon, probably with offers that include significant financial incentives and implied consequences for refusal." The threat assessment was becoming clearer but more complex. Private military recruitment that involved testing rather than negotiation suggested organizations with resources and operational requirements that extended beyond typical security contracts. If Marcus was correct about Meridian Solutions' interest, her civilian identity might already be compromised beyond recovery. "What's your interest in this situation?" Natalie asked, seeking to understand whether Marcus was offering assistance or presenting ultimatums disguised as opportunities. "I'm offering you a better alternative," Marcus said. "Pentagon intelligence has been tracking Meridian Solutions for 18 months. They're recruiting former military personnel for operations that violate several international treaties and domestic laws. We need someone on the inside who can document their activities and identify their operational structure." The proposal was classic intelligence recruitment. Offer protection from one threat in exchange for accepting mission requirements that involve different but potentially greater risks. Marcus was positioning himself as solution provider while carefully avoiding mention of the role his previous betrayal had played in creating her current vulnerability. "Undercover work for the same people who destroyed my military career," Natalie observed. "That seems like poor risk assessment on my part." Marcus's response carried notes of what might have been genuine regret, though his reputation for manipulation made emotional sincerity difficult to assess. What happened 3 years ago was necessary for mission security at the time. Personal feelings couldn't override operational requirements. The attempted justification revealed more about Marcus's current motivations than his past decisions. He needed her cooperation for reasons that probably involved career advancement or damage control, rather than genuine concern for her welfare. Intelligence agencies routinely sacrificed individual operators for larger strategic objectives, making his current offer suspect, regardless of its apparent benefits. "Define the mission parameters," Natalie said, recognizing that understanding Marcus's proposal might provide information about threats she would face regardless of her decision to cooperate. "Meridian Solutions is recruiting assets for an operation scheduled to occur within the next 30 days, Marcus explained. "Location classified, but intelligence suggests the target involves extracting classified technology from a foreign research facility. They need operators with your specific combination of infiltration and extraction skills." The mission profile matched capabilities that had made Ghost Squadron valuable for operations that required surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. Extraction of classified technology suggested targets with sophisticated security systems and international implications that could create diplomatic incidents if traced back to American personnel. "Why not use active military personnel?" Natalie asked, though she already suspected the answer involved plausible deniability that would protect government officials if operations went wrong. "Because if the mission fails, former military personnel operating as private contractors can be disavowed without creating official scandals," Marcus replied with the kind of bureaucratic honesty that confirmed her assessment. "Dead mercenaries don't testify before congressional committees." The admission revealed the true nature of his offer. Marcus needed expendable assets who could be sacrificed without political consequences, making former Ghost Squadron personnel ideal candidates for operations designed with acceptable casualty rates that included total mission failure. "What happens if I refuse both offers?" Natalie asked, seeking to understand whether maintaining her civilian identity remained a viable option. Marcus's pause suggested he was calculating how much truth to reveal about consequences that might follow non-cooperation. "Meridian Solutions doesn't handle rejection well. People who refuse their recruitment offers sometimes experience accidents or disappearances that discourage others from similar refusal." The threat was explicit enough to clarify her actual options: cooperation with Marcus's intelligence mission or acceptance of Meridian Solutions. Private military contract were alternatives designed to appear voluntary while eliminating the possibility of remaining uninvolved. Her civilian identity had been compromised the moment Vincent Kowalski entered her store, whether his mission was robbery or recruitment. "Timeline?" Natalie asked, recognizing that preparation time would determine her ability to develop counter-strategies that might preserve some degree of autonomy. "Meridian contact within 48 hours, Marcus replied. "Their recruitment approach will probably involve demonstrating that your civilian life is more fragile than you've assumed. Family members who could be threatened, business relationships that could be disrupted, official investigations that could reveal background inconsistencies." The psychological pressure techniques were standard for organizations that needed to motivate compliance through fear rather than voluntary cooperation. Meridian Solutions had probably compiled comprehensive intelligence about her current life, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited to ensure her acceptance of whatever operational role they had planned. "I need time to consider the options," Natalie said. seeking to end the conversation before Marcus could present additional pressure or extract commitments that would limit her flexibility. Time is a luxury you don't have, Marcus warned. Meridian operates on accelerated timelines that don't accommodate extended decision-making processes. Delay will be interpreted as refusal, with consequences that match their assessment of your threat potential. The communication ended with Marcus providing encrypted contact information for follow-up discussions, while emphasizing that her decision would determine whether she survived the next week as anything other than a casualty of conflicts between competing intelligence organizations. Natalie returned the satellite phone to its concealed location, while her mind processed tactical implications that extended far beyond simple criminal investigation. Federal agents examining the morning's robbery would soon discover connections to private military recruitment that transformed their case from local crime to national security matter. Her civilian identity was compromised beyond recovery, requiring immediate assessment of survival strategies that went beyond maintaining cover stories. The hidden equipment cache behind her apartment's false wall contained resources sufficient for disappearance and reestablishment under different identity. But 3 years of civilian life had created connections that couldn't be easily severed. Helen Varga's protective friendship, Detective Castellanos' romantic interest, and Tommy Chun's obvious attraction represented emotional investments that made simple disappearance more complicated than tactical withdrawal. More critically, Marcus's recruitment offer suggested that her former military identity was being leveraged by multiple organizations with conflicting objectives. Pentagon intelligence wanted her as expendable asset for operations involving private military companies that recruited former Ghost Squadron personnel for missions that violated international law. Meridian Solutions wanted her as operator for extraction mission that would probably result in elimination of witnesses regardless of operational success. Both options required accepting roles that involved significant probability of death or imprisonment, making civilian disappearance preferable, despite emotional costs associated with abandoning the life she'd built in Riverside Falls. The challenge would be executing withdrawal before federal investigation or private military recruitment created surveillance conditions that made escape impossible. Dawn was breaking over the Cascade Mountains when Natalie began preparations for contingencies that might require immediate departure from everything she'd called home for 3 years. The equipment cache provided resources for multiple identity changes, emergency communication, and travel arrangements that could transport her beyond reach of organizations seeking to exploit her specialized capabilities. The process was methodical and emotionally detached, reflecting training that prioritized survival over sentiment. Classified documents were prepared for secure destruction. Financial assets were consolidated into portable instruments, and transportation was arranged through networks that specialized in moving people who needed to disappear completely. Most painfully, she composed messages that would provide closure for relationships that had defined her civilian existence without revealing information that could endanger the people who'd accepted Natalie Brennan as genuine friend and community member. Helen Varga would receive explanation about family emergency requiring permanent departure. Detective Castellanos would find resignation, letters citing personal reasons that precluded continued residence in Riverside Falls. The hardware store would be transferred to Tommy Chun through legal arrangements that provided him with unexpected ownership of business he'd always admired. The transfer documents included operating instructions and supplier contacts that would allow him to maintain the community service that had justified her presence in Riverside Falls. As morning customers began arriving at neighboring businesses, Natalie realized that her carefully constructed civilian life was ending, not through dramatic confrontation, but through bureaucratic necessity that made continued pretense impossible. Federal investigation would soon connect her to classified military records that couldn't be explained as coincidence. Private military recruitment would escalate to threats that couldn't be ignored or deflected through civilian law enforcement. The transformation from Natalie Brennan back to the operator once known as Phantom was beginning, whether she chose cooperation or resistance. The only variables under her control were timing and tactical advantage, factors that might determine whether she survived long enough to establish new identity in location beyond reach of people who viewed her as either asset or liability. Pine Ridge hardware store opened for what would probably be its final day under her ownership, serving customers who had no awareness that the woman selling them fishing tackle and garden supplies was simultaneously planning disappearance that would erase 3 years of community membership. The normalcy of routine commercial transactions provided cover for preparations that would culminate in departure, so complete that Natalie Brennan would cease to exist except in memories of people who'd known her as neighbor and friend. Tommy Chun arrived at 9:30 with his usual enthusiasm for hardware-related conversation and obvious romantic interest, unaware that he was about to inherit responsibility for business he'd admired from distance. Helen Vargas stopped by with morning coffee and local gossip, continuing protective friendship that had defined much of Natalie's social existence in Riverside Falls. Each interaction carried weight of finality that couldn't be acknowledged without compromising operational security or creating emotional complications that might interfere with tactical decision-making. The people who'd made civilian life meaningful would become part of the past she was abandoning for survival reasons that they couldn't understand or share. Federal agents returned at 11:15 for follow-up investigation that focused on Vincent Kowalski's criminal associations rather than her defensive capabilities, though their questions suggested growing sophistication about the morning's actual events. Agent Moreau's examination of the crime scene had apparently revealed details that didn't entirely support random robbery narrative. "Ms. Brennan," Agent Moreau said, "we've discovered that Vincent Kowalski has connections to organizations that recruit military veterans for private security work. Is it possible that his approach to your store wasn't random criminal activity?" The question indicated that federal investigation was moving toward conclusions that could expose her background regardless of her cooperation. Agent Moreau's professional assessment had probably identified tactical elements that suggested systematic training rather than civilian self-defense. "I don't understand what you're asking," Natalie replied, maintaining confused civilian persona while calculating whether federal protection might provide alternative to disappearance or private military recruitment. Agent Chun consulted his tablet with the kind of focused attention that suggested access to databases containing classified military records. "Have you ever been contacted by private military companies or security firms seeking to recruit personnel with specialized skills?" The direct question indicated that federal investigation had progressed beyond simple criminal case to national security matter, involving recruitment of former military personnel. Agent Chun's access to classified databases probably included records that could connect Natalie Brennan to her previous military identity if someone provided appropriate search parameters. "I manage a hardware store," Natalie said. "I don't have any specialized skills that would interest security companies." Agent Moreau exchanged glances with her partner in a way that suggested they'd discussed her background beyond what she'd revealed in official statements. Their body language indicated professional skepticism about her claims, though they hadn't yet decided whether to pursue investigation that could expose her cover identity. "We may need additional statements as our investigation develops," Agent Chun said. "Please don't leave the area without notifying our office." The instruction carried implications of potential material witness status that would make disappearance more complicated, while providing federal protection that might deter private military recruitment. The challenge would be maintaining civilian cover story while federal agents conducted investigation, sophisticated enough to reveal inconsistencies that local law enforcement had missed. As the federal agents departed, Natalie calculated that she had perhaps 6 hours before Marcus's timeline forced decisions that would determine whether she survived as fugitive from multiple intelligence organizations or accepted operational role that would probably result in elimination regardless of mission success. The equipment cache behind her apartment's false wall contained resources for immediate departure, but federal surveillance would make escape more difficult while private. Military recruitment would escalate to direct action that couldn't be avoided through geographical relocation. For the first time since arriving in Riverside Falls, Natalie Brennan prepared for possibility that survival might require embracing the identity she'd tried so hard to escape. The decision came at 17 minutes past midnight when 3 black SUVs rolled into Riverside Falls with the silent precision of a military convoy. Natalie watched their approach through night vision equipment positioned to monitor all access routes to her apartment, counting personnel and cataloging weapons. Signatures that suggested professional operators rather than federal law enforcement. The vehicles moved without headlights, using terrain features for concealment while approaching her location with coordination that indicated extensive reconnaissance and tactical planning. Marcus Webb's 48-hour timeline had compressed to 18 hours, accelerated by factors that probably included federal investigation progress and operational requirements that couldn't accommodate extended recruitment negotiations. Meridian Solutions had decided that direct action was preferable to psychological pressure, bringing enough firepower to handle resistance while maintaining plausible deniability about their presence in a small mountain town. She activated the apartment's defensive systems with movements that reflected 3 years of preparation for this exact scenario. Motion sensors, remote cameras, and communication jammers came online while emergency protocols began automatic destruction of sensitive materials and evidence that could compromise other former military personnel. The transformation from civilian hideout to tactical position required 90 seconds, revealing capabilities that would have surprised federal agents who'd been investigating her hardware store incident. The lead SUV disgorged 6 operators, who moved with the kind of professional coordination that marked special operations veterans. Their equipment was military-grade but commercially available, the kind of setup that provided maximum capability while avoiding direct connection to government agencies. Night vision, suppressed weapons, and communication gear that enabled silent coordination during complex urban operations. Natalie counted 12 total personnel spread across 3 vehicles, with additional support elements probably positioned to control escape routes and monitor law enforcement response. The force structure was sufficient to handle significant resistance while providing backup options if primary approach encountered unexpected complications. They'd prepared for the possibility that their target possessed capabilities beyond typical civilian resistance. Her own preparations had anticipated exactly this scenario. The apartment above Pine Ridge hardware store had been chosen and modified to provide defensive advantages that would allow single operator to resist superior numbers long enough to execute escape protocols. Reinforced walls, protected firing positions, and multiple exit routes that led to prepared transportation and communication assets. The tactical situation was asymmetric but manageable if she maintained initiative and avoided prolonged engagement that would favor superior numbers. Her objective was escape and evasion rather than elimination of opposition forces, requiring tactical decisions that prioritized mobility over decisiveness. The operators approaching her position expected to find frightened civilian or marginally competent veteran, not someone whose defensive preparations matched their own operational sophistication. Her encrypted communication device buzzed with incoming transmission from frequency that only 3 people should have known about. Marcus Webb's voice carried the kind of professional calm that preceded kinetic operations, though his timing suggested coordination with forces currently surrounding her building. "Phantom, you have 30 seconds to accept my offer before Meridian Solutions makes the decision for you," Marcus said, his transmission probably intended to provide Psychological pressure while operators moved into final assault positions. Counteroffer. Natalie replied, her hands moving through equipment checks that would determine her survival over the next 15 minutes. Go to hell. Marcus's laugh carried notes of what might have been genuine regret, mixed with professional necessity. You always were too stubborn for your own good. Meridian's contract specified live capture if possible, but they're authorized to use whatever force necessary to complete mission objectives. The admission revealed tactical intelligence about operational parameters that influenced her response options. Live capture suggested that her value extended beyond simple elimination, probably involving interrogation and exploitation of her. Knowledge about classified operations. The authorization for lethal force meant that resistance would be met with professional violence designed to overwhelm rather than subdue. Tell them, I'm not interested in either option, Natalie said, while simultaneously initiating electronic countermeasures that would disrupt communication and coordination among the assault team. The attack began with suppressed gunfire directed at her apartment's windows, rounds designed to eliminate lighting and create psychological pressure rather than inflict casualties. The shooters were positioned to avoid hitting critical infrastructure that might endanger nearby civilians, suggesting operational parameters that included concern for collateral damage that could complicate official cover stories. Natalie's response was immediate and asymmetric. Instead of returning fire from defensive positions they expected her to occupy, she activated remotely controlled devices positioned throughout the hardware store below her apartment. Smoke grenades, flashbang simulators, and electronic jammers transformed the building into a confusion matrix that disrupted tactical coordination while providing cover for maneuver. The lead assault team breached her apartment door with professional efficiency, only to encounter prepared defensive positions that channeled their movement toward predetermined kill zones. Claymore mines positioned to appear like routine electrical equipment detonated in sequence, creating casualties and confusion that allowed her to escape through concealed exit route they hadn't identified during reconnaissance. Her movement through the building's hidden passages was silent and practiced, utilizing construction modifications that provided access to adjacent structures without exposure to external surveillance. 3 years of preparation had created escape routes that could transport her beyond immediate tactical engagement while maintaining access to equipment and transportation assets positioned for exactly this contingency. The explosion that destroyed Pine Ridge hardware store was controlled, but dramatic, eliminating evidence while creating distraction that would complicate pursuit operations. Emergency services would respond to apparent gas leak explosion, providing civilian law enforcement presence that would force Meridian Solutions to withdraw before their military-grade equipment attracted federal attention. Natalie emerged from underground tunnel system 2 blocks away, accessing motorcycle position for rapid departure, while monitoring communication frequencies that revealed growing confusion among assault team members. Their tactical coordination was deteriorating, as smoke, jamming, and unexpected resistance created conditions they hadn't prepared for during mission planning. The motorcycle was specialized for mountain terrain and extended range operation, equipped with navigation and communication systems that would allow her to reach prepared safe house 40 miles into forest areas where vehicle pursuit would be difficult or impossible. Her route utilized back roads and logging trails that avoided main highways where roadblocks could be established by either law enforcement or private military assets. Behind her, Riverside Falls was awakening to emergency vehicle sirens and the kind of official activity that marked significant incidents in small communities. The hardware store fire would be investigated as industrial accident unless federal agents discovered evidence linking the destruction to private military operations that violated domestic law enforcement protocols. Helen Varga would assume that Natalie had been killed in the explosion, a conclusion that provided emotional closure while protecting her from potential retaliation by organizations seeking to eliminate witnesses to their failed recruitment operation. Detective Castellanos would investigate the incident professionally, but probably wouldn't discover the tactical sophistication that had enabled her escape. Tommy Chun would inherit hardware store assets through legal arrangements activated by her apparent death, providing him with business opportunity while ensuring community continuity that honored 3 years of civilian life in Riverside Falls. The documentation would satisfy insurance investigators and probate courts without revealing the complex preparation that had made smooth transition possible. The safe house was positioned in mountainous terrain that provided tactical advantages for extended resistance while maintaining communication access to networks that could facilitate identity change and geographic relocation. Solar power, water sources, and supply caches that could support independent operations for several months, while threat assessment determined long-term strategic options. Marcus Webb's communication attempts resumed as dawn broke over the mountains, his transmissions carrying increasing desperation that suggested mission failure would have career consequences extending beyond simple operational disappointment. Pentagon intelligence had probably invested significant resources in recruiting her for operations against Meridian Solutions, making her escape problematic for budget justification and strategic planning. Phantom, you've gained maybe 12 hours before they locate your position. Marcus transmitted on frequency he assumed she was monitoring. Meridian has resources you haven't considered, including satellite surveillance and database access that will identify every property purchase, financial transaction, and communication pattern you've established over the past 3 years. The assessment was probably accurate, but incomplete. Her preparation had included multiple contingencies for exactly the kind of comprehensive investigation that private military companies could conduct through governmental and commercial channels. Identity layers, financial isolation, and communication. Protocols designed to survive intensive scrutiny by organizations with advanced analytical capabilities. They're also monitoring federal law enforcement communications. Marcus continued, his transmission suggesting access to intelligence that confirmed her suspicions about coordination between private military companies and government agencies. FBI investigation of yesterday's robbery has revealed connections to classified military records. Agent Moreau will be requesting Pentagon consultation about your background within the next 6 hours. The information was tactical intelligence that could influence her planning, though Marcus's motivations for providing it remain suspect. Pentagon intelligence might genuinely want her cooperation against private military companies, or they might be using Meridian Solutions as stalking horse for recruitment operation that would ultimately serve similar objectives. Federal investigation would eventually connect Natalie Brennan to classified military records, regardless of her cooperation with either organization. Database searches that included her biometric data, photographic analysis, and tactical assessment of her defensive capabilities would eventually reveal inconsistencies that required explanation involving her previous military identity. The challenge was determining whether federal protection might provide alternative to either disappearance or acceptance of operational roles that involved significant probability of death. FBI investigation could offer legal framework for resisting private military recruitment while maintaining some version of civilian identity, though the process would require revealing classified information about Ghost Squadron operations. Agent Moreau's satellite phone number was among the contact information she'd maintained for exactly this kind of decision point. Federal law enforcement represented the only alternative to complete disappearance or acceptance of operational roles with organizations whose objectives included eliminating witnesses to their activities. The connection took several minutes to establish through encrypted protocols that would protect her location while enabling communication with federal investigators who might not understand the complexity of situation they were examining. Agent. Morrow's voice carried professional alertness that suggested she was prepared for unexpected communication from material witnesses. Agent Moreau, this is Natalie Brennan, she began, recognizing that this conversation would probably determine whether her civilian identity could survive in any recognizable form. Ms. Brennan, where are you? Agent Moreau replied immediately. We received reports of explosion at your store, and local law enforcement assumes you were killed. Are you injured? The concern appeared genuine, though federal agents were trained to establish rapport and cooperation through demonstration of personal interest in witness welfare. Agent Moreau's response would reveal whether FBI investigation had progressed beyond simple criminal case to understanding of national security implications. I'm safe for now, Natalie said, but I need to tell you things about yesterday's incident that weren't included in my original statement. Agent Moreau's pause suggested she was activating recording equipment, while alerting colleagues about communication from witness they'd assumed was deceased. Are you saying there were aspects of the robbery that you didn't report initially? I'm saying the robbery wasn't random criminal activity, Natalie replied, recognizing that everything she revealed would become part of federal investigation that could either protect or prosecute her depending on bureaucratic assessment of her value versus liability. The conversation that followed lasted 47 minutes and covered classified military operations that officially never existed, private military recruitment of former special operations personnel, and Pentagon intelligence operations that used both groups as expendable assets for missions requiring plausible deniability. Agent Moreau's questions suggested professional familiarity with military intelligence operations, though her clearance level might not extend to Ghost Squadron activities. You're claiming that Vincent Kowalski was conducting recruitment assessment rather than attempting robbery, Agent Moreau summarized. That Meridian Solutions has been targeting former military personnel for operations involving classified technology extraction, and that Pentagon intelligence has been using them as stalking horse for recruitment of assets they can disavow if operations go wrong. The summary was accurate, but incomplete, missing the personal history between her and Marcus Webb that explained the sophistication of current targeting operation. Agent Moreau's analysis was professional, but probably insufficient to understand the level of threat represented by organizations that routinely eliminated inconvenient witnesses. Where are you currently located? Agent Moreau asked. We can provide federal protection while investigation determines appropriate response to these allegations. Federal protection was attractive, but historically unreliable when it conflicted with national security priorities that included maintaining relationships with private military companies. Agent Moreau's offer might represent genuine law enforcement commitment or bureaucratic expedient that would last only until Pentagon officials provided alternative assessment of situation. I need guarantees, Natalie said, recognizing that trust required verification rather than acceptance of official promises. Written immunity agreements, congressional oversight notification, and public documentation that prevents my disappearance into classification systems. Agent Moreau's response revealed the limitations of federal protection that didn't extend to overriding national security determinations made by agencies with classification authority. I can offer witness protection and immunity from prosecution for any classified information disclosure required for investigation, but I can't guarantee protection from other federal agencies if they determine your knowledge represents security risks. The honest assessment confirmed Natalie's evaluation that federal cooperation involved accepting different but potentially greater risks than complete disappearance. Witness protection programs were designed for criminals testifying against organized crime, not former military personnel whose knowledge threatened ongoing intelligence operations. I need 12 hours to consider your offer, Natalie said, seeking to maintain negotiation flexibility while assessing whether federal investigation could progress far enough to provide meaningful protection. against private military organizations. 12 hours might be too long, Agent Moreau warned. If Meridian Solutions is actively hunting you, federal protection becomes more difficult to provide the longer you remain outside official custody. The warning was tactically accurate, but politically incomplete. Federal protection would probably include detention that differed from imprisonment only in administrative classification, especially if Pentagon officials determined that her knowledge required permanent isolation from potential hostile intelligence exploitation. The communication ended with Agent Moreau providing secure contact information while emphasizing that federal protection remained available if she decided cooperation was preferable to fugitive status. The offer was genuine within the limitations of federal law enforcement authority, though those limitations might prove inadequate for protection against organizations that operated beyond normal legal constraints. Marcus Webb's satellite phone resumed transmission attempts within minutes of her communication with Agent Moreau, suggesting that Pentagon intelligence was monitoring federal law enforcement communications in real time. His awareness of her contact with FBI agents confirmed the level of coordination between ostensibly separate agencies that supposedly provided checks and balances against each other. Talking to federal agents was strategically unsound, Marcus transmitted, his voice carrying disappointed authority of superior officer addressing subordinate who'd made tactical error. FBI investigation will reveal classified information about Ghost Squadron operations that could compromise ongoing missions and personnel still operating under official cover. The argument was professionally persuasive but personally irrelevant. Given Marcus's role in destroying her military career through testimony that sacrificed her credibility for his advancement, Pentagon intelligence concerns about operational security were legitimate but secondary to survival considerations that took precedence over institutional loyalty. Agent Moreau seems more trustworthy than organizations that test recruitment candidates by staging armed robberies, Natalie replied, recognizing that this communication might be her final opportunity to understand Marcus's actual motivations and objectives. Marcus's laugh carried notes of genuine humor mixed with professional calculation. Moreau's trustworthy within the limitations of her institutional authority, but FBI agents don't determine national security policy. Her investigation will eventually reach classification levels where bureau jurisdiction ends and Pentagon authority begins. The assessment was probably accurate, but didn't address fundamental question of whether any institutional authority could provide protection against private military companies that operated with governmental approval for missions requiring unofficial capabilities. Meridian Solutions represented privatized violence that served official objectives while maintaining plausible deniability about governmental involvement. What happens to federal agents who investigate too aggressively? Natalie asked, seeking to understand whether Agent Moreau's protection could survive Pentagon opposition to FBI investigation. They receive promotions to administrative positions where their investigative capabilities are redirected toward less sensitive matters. Marcus replied with bureaucratic honesty that confirmed her assessment of federal law enforcement limitations. The mountain terrain around her safe house provided tactical advantages for extended resistance, but geographic isolation couldn't protect against satellite surveillance and electronic intelligence capabilities that private military companies access through governmental partnerships. Meridian Solutions had probably already identified her general location and was calculating approach routes that would minimize exposure to federal law enforcement observation. Her equipment cache included communication devices capable of reaching networks that specialized in providing new identities and geographic relocation for individuals whose survival required permanent disappearance from official records. The process was expensive and time-consuming, but had proven effective for other former military personnel whose classified knowledge made them permanent targets for elimination. Alternatively, she could accept Marcus's recruitment offer and use Pentagon intelligence resources to eliminate Meridian Solutions as threat to other former Ghost Squadron personnel. The mission would probably result in her death or imprisonment, but success might protect veterans who lacked her defensive capabilities and tactical preparation. The decision crystallized with the kind of moral clarity that had once defined her military service. Tommy Chun, Helen Varga, and Detective Castellanos represented civilian relationships that deserved protection from organizations that threatened communities to recruit individual assets. Riverside Falls had provided 3 years of peace that was worth defending regardless of personal cost. Marcus Webb answered her communication on the first ring, his response suggesting he'd been waiting for her decision with professional patience. That masked personal investment in the outcome. "I accept your mission parameters," Natalie said, recognizing that this choice would probably mark the end of any possibility for civilian life. "But I want operational control and resource authority, sufficient to complete objectives permanently." Marcus's approval was immediate and comprehensive. Full tactical authority, unlimited resource allocation, and post-mission protection that includes new identity establishment if you survive operational requirements. The agreement was probably more generous than Pentagon intelligence would normally offer former military personnel whose cooperation was obtained through duress, suggesting that eliminating Meridian Solutions served objectives that extended beyond protecting recruitment targets. Marcus's enthusiasm indicated institutional commitment that could provide meaningful protection if she survived mission requirements. "Mission briefing in 6 hours," Marcus continued. "Secure facility near Portland where you'll receive intelligence, packages, equipment authorization, and tactical support that matches operational requirements." The timeline was accelerated but manageable given her current tactical situation and the need to resolve threats before Meridian Solutions located her position or escalated to direct action against civilian communities. Federal law enforcement. Coordination would provide official framework for operations that might otherwise be classified as domestic terrorism. Agent Moreau's secure communication device activated as Natalie prepared to depart her mountain safe house for mission briefing that would probably determine whether any former Ghost Squadron personnel would survive Meridian Solutions recruitment. Operations. The FBI agent's transmission carried urgency that suggested federal investigation had reached conclusions requiring immediate action. "Ms. Brennan, we've discovered additional information about Meridian Solutions that changes our assessment of threat levels," Agent Moreau said, her voice indicating access to intelligence that probably came from Pentagon sources. "They're not just recruiting former military personnel. They're eliminating anyone who refuses cooperation." The revelation confirmed Natalie's tactical assessment while providing federal validation for decisions that might otherwise appear to involve excessive force. Agent Moreau's investigation had apparently reached classification levels where FBI jurisdiction intersected with Pentagon intelligence operations. "We're prepared to provide full federal protection and immunity in exchange for your cooperation with investigation that could result in prosecution of Meridian Solutions leadership," Agent Moreau continued. "Your testimony could protect other veterans while ensuring these organizations face legal consequences for their activities." The offer was attractive, but probably inadequate for protection against organizations that operated with sufficient governmental approval to access military-grade equipment and intelligence resources. Legal prosecution required evidence collection and judicial procedures that provided multiple opportunities for witness elimination before trial proceedings could begin. "I've accepted alternative arrangements," Natalie replied, recognizing that federal cooperation might complement rather than replace operational approaches to eliminating threats. "But your investigation might benefit from coordination with Pentagon intelligence operations that serve similar objectives." Agent Moreau's response suggested professional understanding of interagency cooperation that could provide legal framework for activities that might otherwise require classification beyond normal federal law enforcement authority. We're prepared to coordinate investigation with appropriate Pentagon personnel, Agent Moreau said, assuming such coordination serves law enforcement rather than intelligence objectives that override domestic legal protections. The distinction was professionally important, but tactically irrelevant given the level of threat represented by organizations that recruited through violence and eliminated refusal through assassination. Legal protections were meaningful only when they could be enforced against opponents who recognized governmental authority as legitimate constraint on their operations. The mission briefing facility was positioned in an industrial area outside Portland, occupying nondescript warehouse space that provided security and operational support without attracting attention from civilian populations or potential hostile surveillance. Pentagon intelligence had established temporary command center with communication equipment, analytical resources, and tactical planning capabilities that matched special operations requirements. Marcus Webb greeted her arrival with professional courtesy that avoided reference to personal history while emphasizing current operational priorities. His appearance reflected years of Pentagon assignment that emphasized political awareness over field capabilities, though his tactical knowledge remained current through briefings and analytical study. Meridian Solutions is operating from compound in Eastern Oregon, Marcus began, providing intelligence briefing supported by satellite imagery and electronic surveillance that revealed defensive preparations appropriate for military installation. Facility includes training areas, equipment storage, and communication center that coordinates recruitment operations throughout western United States. The target assessment was comprehensive and current, suggesting that Pentagon intelligence had been monitoring Meridian Solutions for extended period rather than responding to recent recruitment escalation. Marcus's preparation indicated institutional investment that extended beyond protecting individual veterans to eliminating organizational threats that challenged governmental monopoly on military violence. Personnel count ranges from 40 to 60 operators, Marcus continued, with capability levels that include former special operations personnel from multiple service branches. Equipment inventory includes military-grade weapons, communication systems, and transportation assets that enable sustained operations without governmental support. The briefing revealed tactical challenges that would require professional planning and resource allocation beyond single operator capabilities. Meridian Solutions had established defensive posture that anticipated governmental investigation and possible assault, making direct action approach potentially prohibitive in terms of casualty risk and probability of mission success. Recommended approach involves infiltration and intelligence collection rather than direct assault, Marcus explained, providing mission parameters that emphasize surgical precision over overwhelming force. Primary objective is documenting operational structure and leadership hierarchy, with secondary objectives including evidence collection that supports federal prosecution. The mission profile matched her specialized capabilities while providing legal framework that could justify operational activities to congressional oversight and judicial review. Pentagon intelligence was positioning the operation as law enforcement support rather than domestic military action, maintaining constitutional boundaries while achieving objectives that served national security interests. Timeline for infiltration is 72 hours, Marcus continued, with extraction protocols that depend on intelligence collection success and threat assessment regarding continued Meridian operations. The operational window was sufficient for preparation and approach, while maintaining schedule pressure that would prevent extensive countermeasures by target organization. Meridian Solutions was probably aware that their recruitment activities had attracted federal attention, but they might not anticipate direct action by Pentagon intelligence assets. Equipment authorization includes specialized surveillance technology, communication devices, and defensive weapons appropriate for extended solo operation, Marcus said, providing resource commitments that suggested institutional confidence in mission success probability. The support level was comprehensive and professional, indicating Pentagon investment that matched the sophistication of target organization and operational requirements. Marcus's authorization suggested career stakes that motivated thorough preparation rather than expedient resource allocation. Post-mission support includes extraction to secure facility, medical attention if required, and identity establishment that provides permanent protection from retaliation. Marcus concluded, addressing concerns about survival and security that had motivated her acceptance of mission parameters. The protection offer was probably genuine within limitations of Pentagon authority, though institutional commitments could change based on political considerations that prioritized organizational security over individual asset protection. Marcus's promises were reliable only as long as they served broader institutional objectives that might not include permanent witness protection. Equipment selection required 6 hours of detailed planning that balanced operational requirements against mobility constraints and probability of successful infiltration. Surveillance technology needed to document Meridian operations while remaining undetectable by counter-surveillance capabilities that former special operations personnel would certainly possess. Communication equipment required secure connection to Pentagon intelligence while maintaining radio discipline that avoided detection by electronic surveillance systems that private military companies routinely employed for facility security. Her transmissions would need encryption sophisticated enough to resist interception while providing command authority with real-time operational assessment. Defensive weapons were selected for reliability and effectiveness rather than maximum firepower, prioritizing capabilities that would enable escape and evasion rather than sustained combat against superior numbers. The mission emphasized intelligence collection over target elimination, requiring tactical restraint that could prove difficult if circumstances required immediate violence for survival. Transportation to target area utilized civilian cover that avoided federal law enforcement or military vehicle signatures that could alert Meridian solutions to governmental investigation. Her approach route was planned to appear routine while providing access to terrain features that enabled covert surveillance and potential infiltration opportunities. The compound's defensive layout included perimeter sensors, armed patrols, and communication monitoring that revealed professional security awareness appropriate for organization that expected governmental attention. Meridian Solutions had invested in protective measures that could detect and respond to infiltration attempts by trained personnel, making successful intelligence collection dependent on tactical precision rather than equipment superiority. Infiltration required 48 hours of patient observation that identified patrol patterns, shift changes, and defensive vulnerabilities that could provide access to facilities containing operational records and leadership personnel. The compound operated with military discipline that limited opportunities for exploitation while maintaining routine activities that eventually revealed targeting opportunities. Electronic surveillance equipment documented training activities that included weapons handling, tactical coordination, and mission planning for operations that clearly violated domestic and international law. Meridian Solutions was preparing personnel for overseas deployment that involved extraction of classified technology from research facilities protected by foreign military forces. Communication intercepts revealed coordination with governmental agencies that provided operational approval and resource support for missions that served national security objectives, while maintaining plausible deniability about official involvement. Meridian Solutions operated as privatized military capability that enabled governmental actions without congressional oversight or public accountability. Documentation collection required accessing secured areas that contained personnel records, financial transactions, and operational planning that could support federal prosecution. while revealing the extent of governmental cooperation with private military organizations. The evidence was sufficient to destroy Meridian Solutions while implicating Pentagon officials who had authorized their activities. The mission's success created immediate tactical problems regarding extraction and evidence preservation that could survive attempts at elimination by governmental agencies seeking to protect their relationship with private military contractors. Marcus Webb's post-mission support might prove inadequate if evidence threatened officials with classification authority over Pentagon intelligence operations. Agent Moreau's secure communication device provided alternative contact that could ensure evidence reached federal law enforcement, rather than disappearing into classification systems that protected institutional interests over legal accountability. FBI investigation represented the only viable path for public disclosure that could prevent future recruitment operations targeting former military personnel. The decision to transmit evidence simultaneously to both Pentagon intelligence and federal law enforcement created redundancy that could ensure survival of documentation, regardless of institutional attempts at suppression. Agent Moreau's investigation provided legal framework for evidence presentation, while Marcus Webb's operation provided official authorization for intelligence collection methods. Extraction from Meridian compound required utilization of defensive preparations she'd observed during infiltration phase, exploiting routine activities and security vulnerabilities that enabled departure, without alerting personnel to successful intelligence penetration. The facility's defenses were sophisticated but predictable, reflecting standard military security protocols rather than adaptive countermeasures. Transportation to secure location required avoiding both Meridian personnel who might attempt interception and federal agents who might seek to control evidence before it could be properly documented and distributed. Her route utilized terrain features and communication discipline that provided protection against pursuit while maintaining schedule requirements for evidence transmission. The evidence package transmitted to Agent Moreau included documentation sufficient for federal prosecution of Meridian Solutions leadership while revealing Pentagon cooperation that extended to mission authorization and resource provision. The material was legally admissible and professionally comprehensive, providing foundation for investigation that could eliminate private military recruitment targeting former special operations personnel. Marcus Webb's reaction to evidence transmission was immediate and predictably hostile, confirming her assessment that Pentagon intelligence had intended to control information, rather than ensuring legal accountability for domestic military violations. His communication carried threats that revealed institutional commitment to protecting governmental relationship with private military contractors regardless of legal consequences. Transmission of classified materials to unauthorized personnel constitutes treason, Marcus said, his voice carrying official authority that suggested immediate career termination and possible criminal prosecution. Pentagon intelligence will treat this action as hostile operation requiring appropriate response. The threat was professionally serious but legally questionable given the evidence revealed violations of domestic law that superseded classification. Protection for organizational activities. Agent Moreau's federal investigation provided legal framework that could challenge Pentagon claims about unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Evidence of domestic military violations isn't classified, Natalie replied, recognizing that this communication probably marked the end of any possibility for Pentagon protection or cooperation. Federal law enforcement has jurisdiction over crimes committed on American territory, regardless of perpetrator classification. Marcus's response indicated institutional awareness that evidence disclosure could result in congressional investigation and legal prosecution that would eliminate Pentagon relationship with private military organizations while exposing officials who had authorized illegal activities. You've destroyed your career and eliminated any possibility for federal protection. Marcus said, his transmission suggesting that Pentagon retaliation would extend beyond simple administrative punishment to active threat elimination. The warning was probably accurate, but tactically irrelevant given that survival had always depended on eliminating threats rather than accepting governmental protection that could be withdrawn based on political considerations. Marcus's hostility confirmed her assessment that Pentagon intelligence served institutional interests rather than individual asset protection. Agent Moreau's response to evidence transmission was immediate and professionally enthusiastic, suggesting that federal investigation had gained sufficient material for prosecution, while providing framework for witness protection that could survive. Pentagon opposition. FBI jurisdiction over domestic crimes provided legal authority that superseded Pentagon classification claims. This evidence is sufficient for federal prosecution and congressional oversight investigation, Agent Moreau said, her communication indicating institutional commitment to legal accountability that could protect witnesses, regardless of Pentagon objections. We're prepared to provide full federal protection while investigation proceeds. The protection offer was more credible given evidence that provided federal law enforcement with material sufficient for prosecution without requiring continued witness cooperation that could be compromised by Pentagon interference. Agent Moreau's investigation had gained independence that reduced vulnerability to institutional pressure. Federal witness protection was imperfect but superior to alternatives that included Pentagon retaliation or private military elimination. Agent Moreau's offer provided legal framework for survival while ensuring that evidence reached congressional oversight and judicial review that could prevent future operations targeting former military personnel. The Mountain Safe House provided temporary security while federal arrangements were finalized, though Pentagon intelligence would probably attempt location identification and direct action before witness protection could become effective. Her defensive preparations were sufficient for short-term resistance but inadequate for extended siege by professional operators with military-grade equipment. Departure for Federal Protection Facility required coordination with Agent Moreau's security team while maintaining operational discipline that could detect and respond to Pentagon surveillance or Meridian Solutions personnel seeking to eliminate evidence and witnesses. Transportation arrangements emphasize security over speed, prioritizing successful arrival over rapid departure. The federal facility provided comprehensive protection that included physical security, legal representation, and administrative support for congressional testimony that could expose private military recruitment while revealing Pentagon cooperation with domestic military violations. Witness protection was professionally managed and politically insulated from Pentagon interference. Congressional testimony lasted 3 days and covered classified operations that officially never existed, private military recruitment that violated domestic law, and Pentagon intelligence cooperation that enabled activities requiring plausible deniability about governmental involvement. The hearings were conducted with appropriate security classifications while ensuring public accountability for institutional violations. Legal prosecution of Meridian Solutions resulted in criminal convictions that eliminated organizational capability for recruiting former military personnel, while establishing precedent for federal jurisdiction over private military activities. Pentagon officials who had authorized cooperation received administrative punishment that included career termination and security clearance revocation. Witness protection transition required establishing new civilian identity and geographic location. That provided security while enabling productive civilian life that honored 3 years of community membership in Riverside Falls. The process was professionally managed and comprehensively supported, providing foundation for civilian existence that could survive governmental investigation or private retaliation. The new identity honored memory of people who had made civilian life meaningful while providing security that could protect against future threats from organizations seeking to exploit former military personnel. Tommy Chun inherited hardware, store through legal arrangements that ensured community continuity, while Helen Varga and Detective Castellanos received closure that respected their friendship without compromising operational security. 5 years later, the woman who had once been known as Phantom and later as Natalie Brennan worked as community college instructor in Oregon mountain town that resembled Riverside Falls in its emphasis on practical skills and mutual support. Her students learned metalworking and equipment maintenance without awareness that their instructor possessed capabilities that extended far beyond civilian technical education. The classroom provided satisfaction that complemented community membership while maintaining useful skills that could serve protective purposes if circumstances required defending people who couldn't protect themselves. Teaching represented productive, civilian application of military training that honored service, while supporting educational mission that prepared students for productive careers. Federal protection had evolved into genuine civilian life that provided security without requiring continued governmental cooperation or testimony. Agent Moreau maintained professional contact that ensured continued safety while respecting privacy, that enabled normal community relationships and personal development. The past remained classified, but no longer threatened present existence or future opportunities for service that honored military training while supporting civilian objectives. Congressional investigation had eliminated private military recruitment, while establishing legal precedent that protected other former military personnel from similar targeting. Community college students learned practical skills that prepared them for civilian careers, while developing confidence and capability that could serve protective purposes in emergency situations. Teaching provided meaningful civilian application of military training that supported educational mission rather than combat objectives. Mountain town life offered the same kind of quiet satisfaction that had made Riverside Falls meaningful, with community relationships that provided social support while respecting personal privacy. Civilian identity was genuine rather than operational. Cover, enabling authentic relationships that could develop naturally without concern for security compromises. The transformation from special operations soldier to civilian educator was complete and permanent, representing successful integration of military service with civilian life that honored both experiences while serving productive community purposes. Some battles ended with victory that enabled peaceful civilian existence rather than requiring continued military service. The woman who taught metalworking and equipment maintenance to mountain college students had served her country honorably, in ways that couldn't be officially acknowledged, protected her community effectively against threats that couldn't be legally prosecuted, and found civilian life that provided satisfaction without requiring continued violence or deception. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.